Rain slicked the harbor lights when its German shepherd suddenly stopped. No barking, no growl, just a solid body planted in front of his handler. Luke Merritt had walked this route 100 times. Former SEAL, quiet, reliable. The kind of man people trusted to keep moving when things needed not to be questioned. But tonight, his hand tightened on the leash, his pace quickened, and something inside him leaned toward an easier choice. The dog felt it first. Scarred ear, steady eyes. He stepped forward and blocked the path, not in fear, not in defiance, but in loyalty. Somewhere behind a parked truck and incomplete paperwork, a decision was forming that would follow Luke for the rest of his life. No one noticed the pause. No one heard the choice being weighed. But in that small moment, on a wet dock with cameras humming and lights burning overhead, a service dog did not save his handler from danger. He saved him from becoming someone he could not live with. Before we begin, where are you watching from? Leave your country in the comments. And if you believe that God still sends help in quiet ways through loyalty, timing, and grace, subscribe now. This story may remind you that miracles do not always shout. Sometimes they stand still and wait. The rain had been falling over Astoria since before dawn, a slow, patient rain that did not flood the streets or demand attention, but soaked into everything it touched. The Columbia River lay heavy and gray beneath a low ceiling of clouds, its surface broken only by the steady movement of fishing boats returning early, their crews tired and quiet. Astoria was the kind of coastal town that carried its weather like a second skin. People here did not complain about rain. They adjusted their collars, kept walking, and learned to live inside the damp. Luke Merritt noticed the rain because it made the day harder to ignore. At 45, Luke had the build of a man who had once been sharpened by constant physical demand and then left to dull slightly with time. He stood just under 6 feet, broad-shouldered, with a torso that still held its strength but carried it more heavily now. His hair was dark brown, cut short in a way that had once been regulation and had since become habit, threaded with early gray at the temples. His face bore the quiet wear of someone who had spent years outdoors and under stress, lines at the corners of his eyes, a faint crease between his brows that never fully relaxed. His eyes were a muted blue, steady rather than sharp, the eyes of a man who watched more than he spoke. Luke worked the night security shift at the port, a job that paid modestly and demanded reliability more than brilliance. It suited him, or at least it had. The work required long hours of walking, checking gates, logging incidents that rarely happened. It was honest, predictable, and unglamorous. After leaving the Navy SEALs, Luke had discovered that predictability was not boredom to him. It was relief. That morning, predictability had failed him. The supervisor's office smelled faintly of burnt coffee and damp paper. The man behind the desk, Carl Jennings, was in his early 50s, thick around the waist, with thinning hair combed carefully to hide how much was gone. Carl was not cruel, but he was cautious, the kind of administrator shaped by years of balancing complaints from above and resentment from below. He avoided direct conflict whenever possible, and when it could not be avoided, he softened it with language that sounded reasonable, even when it was not. "We're adjusting the schedule," Carl had said, hands folded as if in apology. "Budget's tight. You're off 2 nights this week." Luke had nodded once. He did not argue. Losing 2 shifts meant losing money, but it also meant losing standing. In security work, hours were trust. Fewer hours meant someone was being watched. "There's also been feedback," Carl continued, glancing at a clipboard. "About flexibility. Some of the guys feel you're rigid." Rigid? The word sat between them like something carefully placed. Luke knew what it meant. It meant he did not look away. It meant he logged things others ignored. It meant he did not accept favors, even small ones, even harmless-seeming ones. He had learned the hard way that compromise rarely arrived, announcing its full cost. "I hear you," Luke said evenly. Carl exhaled, relieved by the lack of confrontation. "Just think about it," he said. "We all need to help each other out." Luke had left the office with the rain already tapping against the glass, his jaw set, his hands calm but heavy. By the time he reached the outer yard of the port, the weight of the day had begun to press down on him in a way that felt personal. Hawk was waiting by the security booth. The German Shepherd was 6 years old, large without being bulky, his frame lean and powerful, his coat a deep sable with black shading along his back and shoulders. His ears stood alert, but relaxed, one tipped slightly from an old injury that had healed imperfectly. His eyes were amber brown, intelligent, and observant, and when he looked at Luke, there was no excitement, no anxiety, only recognition. Hawk moved with the confidence of a working dog who knew his role and trusted it. Hawk had been assigned to Luke 3 years earlier, after Luke had begun experiencing episodes of heightened stress that he refused to name. Hawk was trained as a service dog, not for aggression or patrol, but for intervention. He was taught to recognize changes in breathing, posture, muscle tension, and to respond by grounding his handler when those signals crossed a threshold. Hawk did not make decisions for Luke. He created space for Luke to make them himself. Luke clipped the leash onto Hawk's harness and rested his hand briefly on the dog's shoulder, a habit formed without thought. Hawk leaned subtly into the contact, acknowledging it, then stepped forward as Luke began walking. They moved along the perimeter path that followed the edge of the port. The rain softened the sounds of the working harbor, engines, chains, distant voices. Luke's boots made a steady rhythm against wet concrete. Normally, this walk calmed him. Today, it did not. His phone buzzed once in his jacket pocket. Luke stopped under the shelter of an overhang and checked the screen. The number was familiar, though he had not saved it. He did not need to. The name surfaced in his mind immediately. Tom Calder. Tom was in his late 40s, lean and sharp-featured, with restless hands and a smile that never fully reached his eyes. He had worked the docks for years in various unofficial capacities, drifting between legitimate labor and the gray areas that lived alongside it. Tom was charming in a way that made people feel chosen, and unreliable in a way that made them regret believing in that charm. Life had taught him to survive by leaning just far enough into rules to bend them without breaking them outright. Luke hesitated, then answered. "Luke," Tom said easily, as if they had spoken yesterday. "Heard you're having a rough day." Luke said nothing. "Listen," Tom continued, lowering his voice. "I've got something that could help. Nothing big, nothing illegal. Just need you to not notice a thing tonight." Luke pictured Tom's smile, the way it always carried an unspoken expectation. "What thing?" Luke asked. Tom chuckled softly. "See? That's the problem. You ask too many questions. Look, it's simple. 5 minutes. You walk your dog. You don't look my way. That's it." "And I get what?" Luke asked. There was a pause, then, "A little thank you. Cash. You could use it." Luke glanced down at Hawk. The dog stood quietly at his side, ears angled slightly back, attentive not to the conversation itself, but to Luke's breathing, which had begun to shorten without Luke noticing. "I'll think about it," Luke said. "That's all I'm asking," Tom replied. "Meet me by the south gate later. You'll see what I mean." The call ended. Luke slid the phone back into his pocket. The rain seemed heavier now, or perhaps he was simply more aware of it. He felt the familiar pull of rationalization begin its work. 5 minutes was nothing. Looking away was not the same as doing something wrong. People did worse things every day and slept fine at night. Hawk shifted slightly, stepping closer to Luke's leg. The movement was subtle, intentional. Luke noticed it only dimly. "Let's walk," Luke muttered, more to himself than to the dog. They left the main path and moved toward the quieter stretch along the edge of the port, where the lights were fewer and the rain pooled in shallow depressions. Luke's pace increased without his realizing it. His grip on the leash tightened. His shoulders drew in. Hawk noticed all of it. The dog slowed, then stopped entirely. He stepped forward and positioned himself directly in front of Luke, body angled across Luke's path, blocking it without force. Hawk did not bark. He did not pull. He simply stood there, solid and unmoving, his presence demanding acknowledgement. Luke frowned. "Come on," he said, tugging lightly on the leash. Hawk did not move. The rain continued to fall around them, quiet and persistent. Luke exhaled sharply, irritation rising, and then beneath it, something else. Fatigue, frustration, the sense of standing at the edge of a decision that should not matter as much as it did. Hawk held his position, eyes steady, breathing slow and even. His training had taught him to interrupt moments like this, moments when his handler's internal state shifted too far, too fast. Hawk was not judging. He was doing what he had been trained to do, creating a pause. Luke stopped pulling. For a few seconds, neither of them moved. The rain tapped against Luke's jacket. His breathing slowed, just slightly. The world, which had felt narrowed and urgent moments before, widened enough to let a thought through. He looked past Hawk, down the path ahead, and imagined what waited there. Tom. The unspoken expectation. The envelope that would change hands easily, almost casually, the way one small decision could make the next one easier. Luke closed his eyes briefly. "All right," he said quietly, more to himself than to Hawk. Hawk's ears flicked, his posture easing a fraction, though he did not yet step aside. Luke turned away from the quieter path and headed back toward the main lights of the port, his pace slower now, more deliberate. Hawk fell into step beside him immediately, the leash slack between them, his role fulfilled for the moment. The rain continued to fall over Astoria, indifferent to the choices being made beneath it. Luke walked faster than usual, though nothing around him required the speed. The port road stretched ahead in a straight, familiar line, slick with rain and washed pale by overhead lights. There was no emergency, no clock visible on the wall, no voice urging him on. And yet his steps shortened and quickened, his boots striking the pavement with a clipped insistence that belonged to a different state of mind than the one he preferred to inhabit. The leash tightened in his hand. It happened gradually, without intent. His fingers curled more firmly around the leather, compressing it until the grain pressed back into his palm. The loop no longer rested lightly against his knuckles, but pulled straight and taut between him and Hawk. Luke did not register the pressure at first. His attention was turned inward, caught on a single unresolved thought that replayed itself without sound. His breathing changed next. What had been slow and even slipped into something shallower, quicker. Air moved in and out of his lungs without fully settling there, as if his chest were making room for something else. His shoulders lifted slightly with each inhale, his posture tightening, the muscles along his back drawing inward. The rhythm was subtle enough that Luke did not consciously notice it, but it was there, consistent and unmistakable. Hawk noticed immediately. The German shepherd moved beside Luke with the steady cadence of a working dog accustomed to monitoring more than terrain. At 6 years old, Hawk no longer wasted energy on unnecessary motion. His stride was economical, his body aligned, his attention divided between the path ahead and the man he was tethered to. The harness across his shoulders shifted as Luke's grip changed, and Hawk felt the difference through the line of contact they shared. Luke's pace increased again, just slightly, but enough. Hawk's ears angled back a fraction, not in fear or submission, but in focus. His head lowered by a small degree, bringing his line of sight closer to Luke's center of mass. He registered the tightened leash, the altered cadence of Luke's steps, the shortened breath carried through the subtle vibrations of the line. These were not commands. They were signals. They had been taught to him. Hawk had been trained to respond to physiological changes rather than spoken cues. Elevated tension in the leash, shallow breathing, accelerated movement without environmental cause. These indicators, taken together, formed a pattern Hawk recognized not as danger in the world, but imbalance in his handler. When that pattern crossed a threshold, Hawk's role was not to advance or retreat. It was to interrupt. Luke angled forward, intent on continuing, unaware of how far ahead his body was pulling his thoughts. Hawk stopped. The movement was precise and controlled. He shortened his stride, planted his front paws, and stepped forward into Luke's path, turning his body just enough to block without colliding. His chest formed a solid barrier, angled across the line Luke was walking. The leash went fully taut for a brief moment as Luke's momentum met resistance, then slackened as Luke's forward motion halted. Hawk did not bark. His mouth remained closed, jaw relaxed. No sound left him beyond the steady movement of air through his nose. His tail stayed neutral, hanging naturally behind him, neither raised nor tucked. There was no aggression in his posture, no display meant to intimidate or alarm. The action was calm, deliberate, and unmistakable. Luke took another half-step forward before realizing he could not. The sudden stop registered first as irritation. His brow furrowed, and he looked down automatically, confusion flickering across his face. The leash hung between them, no longer pulling him forward. Hawk stood directly in front of him, unmoving. "Come on," Luke muttered, more out of habit than command. He did not raise his voice. He did not snap the leash. He expected compliance, the same easy alignment Hawk usually gave him. Instead, Hawk remained where he was, his body squared, his attention fixed, not on the path ahead, but on Luke himself. Luke tugged lightly on the leash. Hawk did not pull back. He did not resist with force. He simply absorbed the motion and stayed put, his weight evenly distributed, his stance stable. The leash shifted in Luke's hand, but Hawk's position did not change. The rain continued to fall around them, soft and persistent. Luke's breathing hitched once, sharp and shallow, then stalled as his body registered the pause. His chest rose again, then fell, slower this time, the sudden stillness forcing air deeper into his lungs. Hawk leaned forward just enough for the front of his shoulder to make contact with Luke's shin. The touch was light, intentional. It was a grounding behavior, trained to provide physical feedback without pressure. Hawk did not push. He did not brace. He offered presence, a steady point of contact meant to draw Luke's attention back into his own body. Luke stiffened at the contact, then released a breath he had not realized he was holding. The tightness in his hand eased slightly. His fingers loosened, and the leash slipped a fraction through his palm. He became aware of the ache in his forearm, of the tension he had been carrying without noticing. His shoulders dropped by a small but measurable degree. Hawk stayed where he was. He did not step aside at the first sign of change. His training required confirmation, not assumption. Luke's breathing needed to slow fully. His grip needed to release. The imbalance needed to pass. Another breath, then another. Luke's chest expanded more completely this time, the inhale deeper, the exhale longer. The sharp edge of urgency dulled, replaced by something quieter and more controllable. His gaze lifted from the ground ahead to the space immediately in front of him, taking in Hawk's steady form, the rain-dampened pavement, the muted glow of lights reflected in shallow puddles. The moment stretched. From the outside, it would have looked like nothing at all. A man and his dog, standing still on a wet road. No raised voices, no visible conflict, only a pause. Hawk felt the shift. The leash no longer carried tension. Luke's breathing had slowed to a rhythm Hawk recognized as baseline. The contact at Luke's shin no longer met resistance. The pattern that had triggered the intervention dissolved, piece by piece, until it no longer met the criteria that required blocking. Hawk stepped back half a pace. The path ahead reopened, unobstructed. Hawk did not retreat fully. He repositioned himself at Luke's side, ready to move but attentive, his role in that moment complete. He did not look for praise. He did not seek acknowledgement. His task had been to interrupt, not to instruct. Luke stood still for another second, then shifted his weight, testing the ease of movement in his own body. His thoughts, which had been compressed and urgent moments earlier, spread out enough to allow space between them. He felt steadier, more anchored, though he could not have named exactly why. He looked down at Hawk. The dog met his gaze briefly, then turned his head forward, signaling readiness to continue. There was no judgment in the look, no expectation, only quiet availability. Luke nodded once, almost imperceptibly. They moved on together, Hawk falling easily into step beside him, the leash hanging loose between them. Luke's pace was slower now, deliberate. His breathing remained even. The road ahead looked the same as it had moments before, but his relationship to it had changed. The interruption had passed without drama. The decision waiting further down the night had not been made yet, but the momentum driving Luke toward it had been broken. Hawk walked beside him as if nothing unusual had occurred, his presence calm and unremarkable, his work invisible to anyone who did not know what to look for. And Luke kept walking, unaware of how narrowly he had avoided letting his body outrun his judgment. Luke had regained his pace, slower now, more deliberate, but the echo of the interruption still followed him like a wake on water. The port stretched ahead under thinning rain, the light steady and familiar, the night settling back into what it pretended was normal. His boots struck the pavement with measured rhythm, yet something inside him resisted falling fully back into line. The thought he had tried to outrun earlier lingered, quieter but persistent, like a current beneath calm surface water. Hawk walked beside him, close enough that Luke could feel the warmth of the dog's body through the damp air. The leash hung loose, its earlier tension gone, but Hawk's attention hadn't relaxed completely. His ears remained subtly alert, his head level, his gaze shifting between Luke's posture and the road ahead. The German shepherd had returned to position, but not to rest. This was the space between action and resolution, a space Hawk had learned to respect. Luke exhaled slowly, then tightened his jaw. The pause had helped, but it had also irritated him. He had spent years training himself to move forward under pressure, to obey orders without hesitation, to trust that momentum was safer than stillness. Standing still had once meant exposure. Hesitation had once meant danger. The habits formed in those years did not dissolve easily, no matter how long ago the uniform had been folded away. He felt the familiar urge to reassert control. "Heel," Luke said. The word came out even and calm, spoken in the same tone he had used 1,000 times before. It was not shouted. It was not sharp. It carried expectation rather than anger, the sound of a man used to being obeyed by muscle memory, alone. Hawk did not move. The dog remained exactly where he was, standing just ahead of Luke's left leg, body aligned forward, but weight settled firmly into the ground. His posture was neither defiant nor submissive. His head lifted slightly, bringing his eyes level with Luke's line of sight. The amber gaze was steady, focused, unblinking. Luke frowned. For a split second, his mind searched for a practical explanation, a distraction, a misheard command. He repeated it, slightly firmer this time. "Heel." Again, Hawk did nothing. There was no growl, no stiffening of the body, no bristling of fur. Hawk did not bare his teeth or shift his stance in challenge. He simply held his position, absorbing the moment with the quiet confidence of a dog trained not to react, but to assess. Luke felt heat rise in his chest. It was not anger at the dog, not really. It was frustration at the loss of immediacy, at the unexpected resistance from something he trusted to be predictable. His fingers curled reflexively, the old instinct to assert authority tightening his grip on the leash, though he stopped himself before pulling. "Hawk," he said, his voice lower now. The dog's ears flicked once, acknowledging the sound without yielding to it. His gaze remained locked on Luke's face, not aggressive, not fearful, simply attentive. Hawk was not ignoring the command. He was weighing it. Hawk had been trained that obedience was not absolute, it was contextual. Commands were to be followed unless they conflicted with a higher priority: the handler's safety during periods of physiological distress. Elevated stress was not defined by emotion alone, but by measurable indicators. Breathing still slightly elevated. Muscular tension not fully released. A spike in heart rate transmitted through the leash and shared contact. The threshold had not yet cleared. Luke shifted his weight, irritation sharpening. He took a step forward, expecting Hawk to move aside or fall back into position. Hawk did neither. Instead, the dog adjusted minutely, redistributing his weight to maintain the block without force. The movement was economical, controlled, almost imperceptible. Hawk's shoulder remained angled across Luke's path, his stance stable, his presence undeniable. Luke stopped short, breath catching again. For a brief, dangerous moment, his irritation threatened to tip into something harsher. Authority had always been simple for him. You gave an order. It was followed. That structure had once kept people alive. Losing it felt like losing ground. "You're supposed to listen," Luke muttered. Hawk continued to look at him, calm and unmoved. The rain had nearly stopped now, leaving behind a cool dampness that clung to clothing and skin. The port was quiet enough that Luke could hear the distant slap of water against hulls, the low hum of machinery idling far off. No one was watching. There was no audience to judge the standoff between man and dog. That, somehow, made it harder. Luke's breathing hitched again, shallow and quick, before he caught it. He realized with a flash of annoyance that Hawk was doing exactly what he had been trained to do, and that this was not about disobedience at all. It was about timing, about the difference between control and readiness. He stood there, the word heel hanging uselessly in the air between them. Hawk's posture did not change, but the intensity of his focus softened slightly as Luke's breath slowed. The dog leaned forward just enough for the side of his shoulder to brush Luke's leg again, a reminder rather than a demand. Hawk's mouth remained closed. His tail stayed neutral. Everything about him said restraint. Luke let out a long breath through his nose. The heat in his chest cooled, replaced by a familiar, unwelcome sensation, being forced to wait. He had always hated waiting. Waiting meant thinking. Thinking meant remembering. He lowered his gaze, not in submission, but in recalibration, taking in Hawk's steady form, the quiet strength held in the dog's frame. Hawk was 6 years old, but his eyes carried the patience of something older, shaped by repetition and trust. Luke remembered suddenly the handler who had introduced Hawk to him years earlier, a woman named Denise Carter. Denise had been in her early 40s then, compact and athletic, with cropped blonde hair and a voice that rarely rose above conversational volume. A roadside explosion during a deployment had taken her partner and left her with a permanent limp. It had also left her with an unshakable belief that control was not about dominance, but about timing. She had told Luke once, while Hawk lay between them, that the dog's job was not to obey blindly, but to know when not to. Luke had nodded at the time, half listening. Now, standing in the damp quiet of the port, the memory landed with more weight. He loosened his grip on the leash deliberately, opening his hand until the leather rested lightly against his palm again. His shoulders dropped. He shifted his stance, grounding his weight evenly through his feet. The tension bled out of him in increments, not all at once, but enough. Hawk felt it. The dog's head tilted a fraction, ears easing back into a more neutral position. His body remained in place for another second, confirming the change. Then he stepped back smoothly, aligning himself at Luke's side. The block dissolved without ceremony, as if it had never existed. The command heel was no longer necessary. Luke stood still for a moment longer, letting the irritation pass completely. He was aware now of how close he had come to pushing through the moment, out of habit alone, to treating the dog's resistance as a challenge rather than a safeguard. The realization did not sit comfortably, but it was honest. He looked down at Hawk. "All right," he said quietly. Hawk did not look back at him. He faced forward, ready to move, his role fulfilled. There was no satisfaction in his posture, no sign that he had won anything. This had not been a contest. They resumed walking, Hawk matching Luke's pace with ease, the leash swinging gently between them. Luke's steps were slower now, not because he had been forced to slow, but because he had chosen to. The irritation had faded, replaced by a cautious clarity. Whatever decision waited ahead of him, it would not be made in a rush. Behind them, the place where Hawk had stood his ground blended back into the ordinary geometry of the port, indistinguishable from any other stretch of wet pavement. No mark remained, no sign announced what had occurred there. Only Luke carried it forward, the quiet knowledge that even familiar commands could fail when they were spoken at the wrong moment, and that sometimes the most important intervention was not compliance, but refusal. The pause lasted only a few seconds, but it opened a space inside Luke Merritt that had been closing all evening. The rhythm of his breathing shifted, shallow bursts stretching into longer pulls of air. His hand loosened on the leash without him noticing, fingers uncurling as if reminded they no longer needed to brace for impact. Hawk remained in front of him, unmoving, body squared and calm, not blocking with force, but with certainty. And in that stillness, Luke finally lifted his eyes. The port at night was a place of partial truths. Pools of light ended abruptly, leaving shadows to finish the sentence. That was when he saw the truck, parked just out of the main lane, nose angled away from the dock, dark enough to disappear if it needed to. Not abandoned, not official, just waiting. The kind of vehicle you didn't notice unless you were trained to notice what didn't quite belong. His gaze slid farther. A familiar figure stood near the edge of the access road, posture relaxed in a way that only came from confidence, not comfort. Someone Luke hadn't spoken to in years, but hadn't forgotten. A man from the old port world where things happened quietly and questions were considered inconveniences. He wasn't waving, wasn't calling out, just standing there, eyes tracking Luke, waiting for a look. A glance, a signal that said we're still the same. Luke felt a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with fear. Nothing had happened yet. No alarms, no crime in progress, just shapes, positions, timing. But he knew this pattern. He'd seen it before, in other places, under other skies. This was how trouble introduced itself. Not loudly, not all at once. It started by asking for nothing more than your absence. If he kept walking the way he had planned, if he chose the shorter path and told himself it was just exhaustion talking, he would still be able to say he hadn't done anything wrong. Technically. But the thought sat poorly, heavy. Because he also knew that once you let yourself not see something, it became easier the next time. Hawk didn't pull, didn't turn his head toward the truck or the man. The dog wasn't pointing out danger. He was anchoring Luke in the present, giving him enough space to let his training and his conscience catch up to each other. Luke stayed where he was. Rain whispered against metal somewhere down the dock. A distant engine idled and then cut. The man by the road shifted his weight slightly, as if testing whether the moment would tip. Luke felt the tension stretch between choice and consequence, thin as wire, humming. This wasn't the moment to act. But it was the moment everything became clear. The dog hadn't shown him what to do. He had shown him the cost of doing nothing. Luke stood there, breathing evenly now, eyes open, fully awake to the fact that whatever came next would stay with him. Hawk held his position, steady and silent, as if guarding not a body, but a decision still being formed. The dock grew quieter as Luke Merritt resumed his patrol, not faster now, but steadier. The rain had thinned into a light coastal mist, the kind that clung to skin without ever fully falling, and the night air carried the mixed smells of salt, oil, and old wood. Hawk walked beside him again, no longer blocking, no longer anchoring him in place, but close enough that Luke could feel the warmth of the dog through the leash. The pause behind them had not ended anything. It had opened something, and once opened, it refused to close quietly. Luke had learned long ago that memory did not arrive politely. It did not wait for permission or timing. It came when the body relaxed just enough for the mind to stop guarding itself. As he walked, boots striking the concrete in an even rhythm, the port lights began to blur into something else, something older, harsher, stripped of color. He was back in another place, another night, another version of himself. It had been a coastal operation overseas years ago when Luke was still active, still carrying the weight of command on his shoulders and the confidence that came with being trusted to make calls quickly. The mission itself had been straightforward on paper. Secure a transit point. Maintain overwatch. Do not engage unless conditions escalated. Simple rules, clean lines. Except nothing ever stayed simple once people were involved. They had been tired. That was the first truth. Heat, lack of sleep, constant noise that never fully shut off. His team had been stretched thin, rotating shifts with barely enough time to drink water and check gear. Luke remembered the way sweat had soaked into his uniform until it felt like part of his skin, remembered the dull ache behind his eyes that made everything feel slightly distant, slightly unreal. The decision had come late in the shift. A local contact, nervous and talkative, had suggested a shortcut. Not a lie exactly, not a betrayal, just a small adjustment, offered with the promise that it would save time and smooth the operation. Luke had listened, he had weighed the options, and then he had nodded. It wasn't reckless. That was the dangerous part. It felt efficient, practical, flexible, the kind of choice experienced operators were praised for. No one died, no one was hurt. The mission completed without incident. On paper, it was a success. But something shifted after that. Luke remembered the way standards softened almost imperceptibly. How the next decision came a little easier. How flexibility became habit, and habit became justification. None of it dramatic enough to trigger alarms. No single moment that could be pointed to and condemned. Just a slow erosion, like water wearing down stone, until he found himself questioning lines he had once sworn were immovable. The cost hadn't been immediate. It never was. It came later, in the quiet moments, in the after-action reports that read clean while leaving a bad taste behind. It came in the way trust felt thinner, less absolute. And eventually, it came in the form of a reassignment that no one framed as punishment, but everyone understood as correction. Luke had stood alone that night, years ago, after turning in his gear, staring out at a horizon that looked nothing like home, and he had made himself a promise. Not to the team, not to command, to himself. I will never take the first step down that path again. The memory settled heavily now as he walked the port road, the past overlaying the present with uncomfortable precision. Tonight had not asked him to do anything illegal. Not yet. It had asked for something smaller, a few minutes of absence, a moment of looking the other way, the same beginning, dressed in different clothes. Hawk slowed slightly, matching Luke's pace as if sensing the shift in his handler's posture. The dog was 5 years old, a mature German shepherd with a sable coat darkened along the spine and intelligent amber eyes that missed very little. Trained as a service dog after Luke's discharge, Hawk had learned routines, patterns, and responses. But what made him exceptional was not obedience. It was awareness. He watched Luke the way seasoned operators watch terrain, noting changes that mattered. They passed a small security kiosk near the edge of the port, its lights still on, though the attendant inside looked half asleep. The man was new, young, with a narrow build and a face that still carried the softness of someone not yet worn down by long nights. He nodded to Luke, polite but distracted, and Luke nodded back. Nothing to report. Nothing to say. The kind of normal that hid easily behind routine. As Luke continued, another figure entered his awareness. A woman stood near a service gate farther down the dock, speaking quietly into her phone. She was tall, lean, with dark hair pulled into a low ponytail that suggested practicality rather than style. Her jacket bore the logo of a shipping company Luke recognized, one that operated on tight margins and tighter schedules. She looked up briefly as Luke passed, eyes sharp, assessing, then returned to her call. Sarah Collins, he remembered. Mid-30s, efficient, known for keeping things moving. Not unfriendly, but not interested in conversation either. She was the kind of person who valued results and preferred not to ask too many questions about how they were achieved. Luke felt the tension in his chest tighten again. The port was full of people like Sarah, people whose livelihoods depended on things flowing smoothly. That was how pressure worked. It spread outward, touching everyone, blurring responsibility until no one felt fully accountable. He stopped near the end of the pier, not because Hawk blocked him this time, but because he needed the stillness. The water below reflected the lights in broken lines, shifting constantly, never holding a shape for long. Luke rested his hand briefly on Hawk's harness, fingers pressing into the familiar fabric, grounding himself in the present. I almost forgot, he thought. Not the rule, the promise. The realization did not come with shame. It came with something heavier and more useful: clarity. He understood now why Hawk had stopped him earlier, why that small interruption had mattered. It had not been about danger in the immediate sense. It had been about direction. Luke drew in a slow breath and let it out fully. The night around him continued, as it always did. Trucks idled in the distance. Radios crackled faintly. Somewhere, metal clanged against metal as a container was shifted into place. Life went on, indifferent to the weight of individual decisions. He turned back toward the main path, toward the areas that were visible, monitored, expected. Hawk followed without hesitation, gait smooth, confident, as if satisfied that whatever internal battle had been stirring was settling into alignment again. Luke did not know yet how he would respond when the moment came. He had not rehearsed words or planned confrontations. But the memory had done its work. It had reminded him who he was when he was at his best, and who he became when he allowed himself to compromise for convenience. Tonight he had come dangerously close to forgetting that difference. As they walked on, Luke felt the weight of knowing settle into place, not as a burden, but as a responsibility reclaimed. The decision was not made yet, but the path was clear again, and for the first time since the night began, his steps felt truly his own. Luke slowed as the service road fed back into the main loading corridor, the part of the port designed to be seen. The lighting here was harsh and functional, white lamps mounted high on steel arms, erasing most shadows by force rather than kindness. Painted lane markings cut clean lines across the concrete, and cameras sat above them like patient witnesses that never blinked. Hawk moved beside him with quiet assurance, leash loose, gait even, his earlier intervention already fading into something unremarkable. To anyone watching, they were simply a man and his service dog doing a routine walk. The truck waited near Bay 7. It was a mid-sized freight truck, engine idling, trailer sealed, but not yet cleared. The company logo on the side belonged to a regional logistics contractor Luke had seen before, the kind that ran tight schedules and tighter margins. Not notorious, not clean either, just familiar enough to invite assumptions. The driver sat behind the wheel with one arm resting out the window, Posture relaxed but alert, like someone prepared to roll the moment he was waved through. Luke adjusted his path and approached from the front, placing himself squarely in view. The driver climbed down when he saw Luke coming. He was in his early 40s, thick-necked and broad-backed, the build of a man who spent long hours sitting and lifting in equal measure. His face was lined more by habit than age, skin weathered, eyes sharp but tired. A knit cap covered thinning hair, and his jacket carried the faint smell of diesel and stale coffee. He offered a quick, practiced smile, polite enough to pass. "Evening," the driver said, "just heading out." Luke nodded once. Neutral, professional, no greeting beyond acknowledgement. "Paperwork, please," Luke said. The words landed plainly, without emphasis. Not a challenge. A procedure. The driver hesitated for half a second too long, then reached into the cab and pulled out a slim folder. He handed it over with a casual motion, as if the contents were already settled. Luke took the folder and stepped slightly to the side, positioning himself under a light. Hawk sat at his heel without being asked, posture upright, ears relaxed, eyes scanning the area in slow, methodical sweeps. Luke opened the folder. The documents were close to complete. That was the problem. Bills of lading, shipping manifests, routing slips, dates matched, signatures were present. But the clearance form was missing a secondary authorization stamp, the one required for late-night departures involving mixed cargo. The omission wasn't dramatic. It was easy to miss if you wanted to miss it. Luke didn't want to. He flipped through the pages again, slower this time. Checked the trailer number against the manifest. Verified the time window. Everything else aligned neatly, almost too neatly, like a story told with unnecessary confidence. He closed the folder and looked at the driver. "You're missing clearance authorization," Luke said. His voice stayed level. "This load isn't approved for departure yet." The driver frowned, a crease forming between his brows. "It should be there," he said. "Dispatch said we were good." Luke shook his head once, not dismissive, just factual. "It's not," he replied. "Without it, the truck stays." The driver exhaled sharply, irritation flashing across his face before being reined in. He glanced down the corridor, then back at Luke. "Look, man, it's late. That stamp usually comes through later." "It always does." Luke met his eyes and held them. "Tonight it didn't," he said. Silence stretched for a moment. The engine continued to idle, a low, steady vibration in the air. Hawk shifted slightly, adjusting his position, then settled again, unbothered. He wasn't guarding the truck. He was watching Luke. The driver rubbed a hand over his jaw, frustration bleeding through the polite veneer. "If I wait, I miss my window. That's not on me." Luke nodded once. "I understand." It was true. He did, but understanding didn't change procedure. "You can contact dispatch," Luke continued. "Once the authorization comes through, I'll clear you. Until then, you're parked." The driver looked at Luke for a long second, searching for flexibility, for the crack where persuasion lived. He didn't find it. Luke's posture remained open, his hands relaxed at his sides, his stance neutral but immovable, not defensive, not aggressive, just present. From the corner of his eye, Luke caught movement. The familiar figure from earlier stood farther down the corridor, partially obscured by a container stack, watching. No gestures, no signals, just observation. Luke did not look back. The driver sighed, shoulders slumping a fraction. He muttered something under his breath and climbed back into the cab, slamming the door harder than necessary. The engine revved once, then settled back into idle. A phone appeared in his hand as he leaned forward, already dialing. Luke stepped back, giving the truck space without giving ground. Hawk rose smoothly and returned to Luke's side, leash still slack, body language calm. The dog's work was invisible now, but Luke felt the difference. Earlier, this moment might have slipped past him. Earlier, he might have told himself it wasn't his problem, that someone else would catch it later. Tonight, he was here, awake, aligned. Sarah Collins passed by again, clipboard tucked under one arm. She slowed slightly when she noticed the stopped truck and Luke standing nearby. Her eyes flicked to the driver, then to the paperwork in Luke's hand. Something like approval crossed her face, brief and unspoken. She gave Luke a small nod and continued on, already moving toward her next task. Luke logged the stop into his handheld device, fingers moving with practiced ease. Time, bay number, reason, incomplete documentation. The entry was clean, unemotional, unremarkable. Exactly how it should be. The phone in Luke's pocket buzzed once, then stopped. He didn't check it. The night resumed its ordinary rhythm. A forklift passed. A radio crackled. Somewhere, a container was shifted into place with a metallic thud. Nothing dramatic had happened. No confrontation. No raised voices. Just a truck that didn't move because it wasn't cleared to move. Luke exhaled slowly. He felt no rush of pride, no sense of victory, only a quiet steadiness, the kind that came from doing the job as it was meant to be done. He clipped the folder back to the driver's side mirror with a note attached and turned away, continuing his patrol along the lit corridor. Hawk walked beside him, calm as ever, as if this had been the plan all along. Morning arrived without ceremony, pale and windless, the harbor wrapped in a low coastal haze that softened edges and dulled sound. Luke Merritt sat at a metal cafe table just outside the port's administrative building, a paper cup of coffee cooling between his hands. He hadn't touched it in several minutes. Steam no longer rose. The bitterness had settled into something flat and forgettable. Hawk lay beneath the table with his chin on his paws, eyes closed, breathing deep and even, the posture of a dog who had done his work and found no reason to remain alert. The quiet would not last. It never did. Voices carried across the plaza in uneven bursts, the sound of people assembling news out of fragments. A security truck rolled past slower than usual, lights off but presence loud. Two supervisors crossed the lot with clipped steps, badges swinging, faces set into the careful neutrality of professionals preparing for disruption. Luke listened without appearing to. Years of training had taught him how to absorb information while staying still. By the time the first rumor reached his table, it had already grown a spine. There had been an arrest near Bay 7 just before dawn. Not dramatic, no sirens, no chase. A quiet stop, paperwork exchanged for cuffs, a driver escorted into the back of a patrol car while the fog still clung to the ground. Word spread quickly that it wasn't just one man. A small group, operating under the name of Flexible Protection, had been flagged. Men who weren't on the books but wore vests and spoke with confidence. Men who believed presence could substitute for authority if delivered convincingly enough. The phrase flexible protection made Luke's jaw tighten slightly. A woman took the table across from him, uninvited but not unwelcome. Her name was Denise Harper, mid-40s, compact build, hair cropped short and streaked with gray she refused to hide. Denise ran logistics compliance for the port, a job that required equal parts patience and refusal. Years earlier, a shipment she'd signed off on had been rerouted illegally, and though she hadn't been charged, the incident had sharpened her instincts permanently. She had learned to distrust convenience. "You here?" Denise asked quietly, lowering her voice as if the morning itself might be listening. Luke nodded once. "Some?" She sipped her coffee, eyes scanning the lot. "They're calling it a cleanup," she said. "Long overdue." Another figure approached from behind her, tall and spare, posture stiff even out of uniform. Officer Caleb Rourke stopped beside the table, hands resting on his belt. Early 30s, sharp cheekbones, eyes that rarely stopped moving. He'd transferred from a larger city department 2 years earlier after a case that ended clean, but cost him friends. Since then, he trusted process more than people. "Morning, Luke," Rourke said. His gaze flicked briefly to Hawk, then back. "You were on shift last night." "I was," Luke replied. Rourke nodded. "Good timing," he said, and moved on. Denise watched him go, then leaned back. "They've got a list," she said. "Names, people who stepped aside when they shouldn't have, people who told themselves it wasn't their problem." Luke didn't ask how she knew. Denise always knew. "Is mine on it?" he asked. She met his eyes. "No." The word landed quietly but carried weight. Luke felt it settle in his chest, not as relief exactly, but as confirmation. He nodded once more. Across the plaza, Sarah Collins stood near the glass doors of the admin building, phone pressed to her ear. In daylight she looked sharper, her movements precise, dark hair pulled back into a knot that never loosened. Sarah had built her career by keeping cargo moving and problems contained. Years ago, a missed compliance detail had cost her a promotion, and she had never allowed herself to forget it. Now she watched the port with a practiced eye, absorbing the shift in tone. When her call ended, she glanced toward Luke, held his gaze for a second, and then looked away. Nothing needed to be said. The investigation widened as the morning wore on. 2 unmarked vehicles parked near the docks. Clipboards appeared. Conversations grew hushed. A rumor circulated that several night shift contractors were being questioned, their claims of authorization unraveling under scrutiny. The phrase "turned away at the right moment" floated through the air like an accusation without a target. Luke remained seated. He watched a seagull hop along the curb, head cocked, evaluating crumbs. Hawk stirred beneath the table, lifted his head briefly, then settled again, tail thumping once against the concrete. 5 years old, strong and steady, Hawk had learned the rhythm of Luke's life as well as any teammate ever had. He had learned when to interrupt and when to rest. Denise stood and gathered her bag. "They'll want statements," she said. "Eventually." Luke nodded. "I'll give one if they ask." She studied him for a moment, then smiled faintly. "You always do." After she left, Luke finally lifted the coffee cup and took a sip. Cold. He grimaced slightly and set it back down. Rourke returned an hour later, this time with a thin folder tucked under his arm. He didn't sit. He didn't open it. "They're closing the loop," he said. "Truck from last night is impounded. Driver's cooperating." Luke absorbed the information without reacting. Rourke hesitated, then added, "You did your job." Luke met his eyes. "That's all." Rourke nodded, satisfied, and walked away. The port settled into a different kind of normal by mid-morning. The frantic edge dulled. Containers moved. Radios crackled with routine updates. The cleanup, as Denise had called it, continued quietly, methodically. Luke remained outside, letting the sun burn off the last of the fog. He thought briefly of the road he hadn't taken the night before, of the ease with which things could have gone differently. The investigation would have caught someone else eventually, perhaps, or perhaps not. He knew better than to build comfort out of hypotheticals. Hawk rolled onto his side, legs twitching as he drifted deeper into sleep. Luke watched him for a moment, then rested his hand lightly against the dog's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth there. No words, no praise, just presence. When his phone buzzed this time, Luke checked it. A message from his supervisor, short and unadorned. "Good work last night. See me later." Luke stood, stretched, and clipped the leash to Hawk's harness. The dog rose smoothly, shook once, and looked up at him, ready. They walked back toward the docks together, the morning brighter now, the air clearer. Somewhere behind them, names were being written down. Elsewhere, questions were being answered too late. Luke's wasn't among them. The weeks that followed did not bring fireworks or headlines. They brought routine, which Luke Merritt had come to recognize as its own kind of reward. The port returned to its steady cadence, a working rhythm of engines and radios and human voices negotiating the small distances between rules and reality. Luke kept his shifts. He kept his posture. He kept the habit of arriving early and leaving without comment. Nothing about his life suddenly grew larger. It grew cleaner. Luke did not get rich. His bank account still required attention, still demanded restraint. He learned which bills could wait and which could not, learned the patience of planning without panic. The warning he had received weeks earlier about flexibility never came up again, not because the system softened, but because his work had become unmistakably consistent. Clean reports, clear decisions, a steady presence that did not drift. What did change arrived quietly, the way trust often does. One afternoon, his supervisor asked him to sit in on an orientation. "Just to observe," the man said, as if it were an afterthought. Luke stood at the back of the room while a group of new hires gathered around folding tables, their boots too new, their faces still holding the hopeful alertness of people not yet tired by repetition. He noticed how they watched him when his name was mentioned, how a few nodded as if they had already heard it before. The supervisor introduced him without ceremony. "This is Luke. He doesn't leave his post." It wasn't praise, it was description. After that, the requests came more often. "Walk this new guard through the night route. Show this trainee how to read the dock without staring at it. Explain why some procedures mattered even when nothing seemed wrong." Luke didn't lecture. He demonstrated. He showed them how to stand where they could be seen, how to slow down when pressure tried to rush them, how to let the work speak for itself. Sarah Collins crossed paths with him more frequently now. Their conversations stayed brief, efficient, but something in her tone shifted over time. She trusted his presence, trusted that if Luke was assigned to a zone, it would be handled. Sarah had built her career on efficiency sharpened by failure, and she respected people who learned the right lessons. Once, as they passed each other near Bay 7, she said quietly, "You did the right thing." She did not wait for a response. Luke didn't need to give one. Hawk adjusted to the new normal as well. The German shepherd had always been calm, but now there was a settled ease to him that bordered on contentment. 5 years old, broad-chested and strong, his sable coat gleamed in the afternoon light as if the port air agreed with him. He slept more deeply during the day, woke more readily at dusk, and moved through the evenings without tension. The grounding behaviors that once had to be practiced faded into something almost ceremonial. Hawk still knew them. He simply did not need to use them as often. Their evening walks continued. They followed the same routes most nights, loops of concrete and steel softened by distance and familiarity. Luke kept the leash loose, his hand relaxed. Hawk walked beside him, not ahead, not behind, a companion rather than a barrier. The port at night had become legible again, its sounds and shadows arranged into patterns Luke could read without effort. The urgency that once tightened his chest no longer ruled his steps. One evening they passed the cafe where Luke had sat with cold coffee weeks earlier. The metal tables were occupied now, laughter drifting into the air as workers ended their shifts. Luke nodded to a few familiar faces. Someone called out his name. Hawk's tail gave a brief, lazy sweep. Life continued. Luke understood something then that he had not fully grasped before. The dog had not saved him from danger in the way stories like to frame such things. There had been no dramatic confrontation, no physical threat narrowly avoided. Hawk had saved him from a moment when convenience had nearly outweighed character, a moment when silence would have been easier than responsibility. The intervention had been small, almost invisible. A pause, a placement, a chance to breathe. That was enough. On nights when the wind came in off the water and the lights shimmered across the docks, Luke sometimes thought about how easily the story could have bent the other way. He did not dwell on it. He acknowledged it and moved on. Regret, he had learned, was not a place to live. It was a signpost, useful only if you kept walking. Hawk stopped briefly near the end of the pier one night, nose lifting to the breeze. Luke stopped with him, unprompted, resting a hand on the harness. They stood there together, listening to the water lap against the pilings. Nothing pressed, nothing demanded. Luke smiled, small and unremarkable, and resumed walking. He kept his job clean. He earned a reputation that did not require explanation. He became the man people trusted to stay when others looked away. And every evening, as the port settled into its long, patient night, Luke and Hawk walked their route, not because they needed saving anymore, but because they had already learned how to choose. This story reminds us that miracles do not always arrive with thunder or flashing signs. Sometimes they come quietly, in the form of a pause, a loyal companion, or a small interruption that saves us from making a choice we would regret for the rest of our lives. God often works through ordinary moments and ordinary faithfulness. He places something or someone in our path not to force us, but to give us time to choose what is right. In daily life, the greatest danger is not always obvious evil. It is the small compromise. The moment we tell ourselves it is easier to look away, to stay silent, to take the shorter road. Like Luke, we are tested not by dramatic crises, but by quiet decisions no one else may ever see. And yet, heaven sees them all. God gives us signs in many forms, a conscience that will not rest, a memory that speaks at the right moment, a loyal friend, even a service dog that knows our hearts better than we do. These are not accidents. They are gentle miracles, reminders that we are not walking alone. If this story touched you, take a moment today to pause before your next decision. Choose the longer way if it is the right one. Stand your ground when it would be easier to step aside. Be the person who does not leave their post. Share this story with someone who might need encouragement. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from. Subscribe to the channel for more stories of faith, courage, and quiet miracles. May God bless you, protect your steps, and guard your heart. May He give you wisdom in moments of choice and peace in moments of doubt. If you believe this message, comment Amen.